Welcome to our JavaScript web course. In this video, we will cover form validation. Form validation is a process of examining the HTML form element's contents. We do that to avoid errors or inaccurate data being sent to the server. This obviously improves the quality of the web application. HTML5 has introduced some new input types and attributes to assist with validation. These new input types are for all practical purposes just text boxes, so you can treat them in that manner. The new attributes give us the ability to require that a certain element have a value and also to indicate the type of value that it should have and to give an example of the value inside that form element if it is a text box. Although HTML5 can be useful in form validation, a good programmer will also validate with JavaScript and on the server. You always want to be sure that you are sending accurate data because ultimately this data will probably be inserted into a database. This is an example of how JavaScript works with a client-sided form, which is what we have been using so far. We can take input from the user, process that, and display it back on the web page. However, that data is not stored anywhere, it is not sent anywhere, and once you close the web page, that data is gone. So let's begin by looking at an HTML form. And in this course, I will be covering the basic HTML form elements. A form typically consists of text boxes where the user will enter some data, radio buttons where they will click on a circle, check boxes where they will click on a square, drop-down list where they will click an arrow, a larger text area box where they will enter text, and buttons which they will click on. So there are essentially two parts to a form. The first part is just the HTML layout, the elements. The second part is the processing. That has to be done on a server using a server technology. JavaScript cannot process the data in a web page outside of displaying it back on the page as we have been doing so far. The server processing will intercept or receive the data and process it. It may send an email back to the user. It will probably send back a response on the web page or direct you to another web page. It will probably also update a database, and it can do other things. These are some common server languages used to process form data. PHP is a very popular language which is offered in most colleges. It is very important to understand how forms work. Here we see the form element. I have an opening and closing form tag. All of the form elements are placed inside the opening and closing form tag. Let's take a look at the attributes. Every form element will have a name attribute and an ID attribute. The action attribute of the form element indicates the name and path of the server file that will process this data. The method indicates the manner in which the data will be sent. If it is sent in a post, it is sent in the body of the message. If it is sent in the GET, it will be sent in the address bar. Search engines use a GET. Notice my search term, form validation, JavaScript example. Notice those values are sent in the address bar to the server. A result page is returned. Method equals post, you do not see the values being sent, so obviously it is more secure. Input type equals submit. This is a very important type. When the user clicks on that button, it will call the action of the form and the data will be sent to the script on the server. So far, we have been using type equals button. Type equals button does not call the action of the form. Type equals button just calls a JavaScript function and it performs some client-sided application. So this is an example of data being sent to the server. Every form element has a name attribute. And when the user enters data or clicks or checks something, it is paired with a value. Those name-value pairs are sent to the server for processing. The issue with validating a form with JavaScript is that the minute the user clicks that submit button, the name-value pairs are sent. So the object of form validation is twofold. Number one, we want to check the form elements for any requirements or errors before the data is sent. So number two, we need to prevent that action from being called until the form is validated. Again, we need to prevent the action from being called in order to validate the form. The minute the user clicks on input type equals submit, it calls that action and the data is sent to that form processing program or script. First, we will access the form element using getElementById, store that in a variable. Now we will add the addEventListener method. Now, why didn't we access the button? Well, because type equals submit directly works with the form tag because that's where the action is. We are no longer merely clicking a button. We are submitting a form. Therefore, we work with the form itself and we work with the submit event. This is not a click event anymore. It is a submit event because we are calling the action. So here's addEventListener, and the event is submit, and essentially I have a function somewhere called checkForm. So we know how to set up event listeners here. Now here's my function checkForm. I am passing it a value E, which stands for the event object, which was covered a few weeks ago. Here's this statement, e.preventDefault. Very, very important. This will prevent the default action of the data being sent to the server, because that is the default action when you click the submit button. Now, once we validate the form, how do we send the data? It needs a little bit of coding. We need to have a way of determining when the data has been validated and everything is correct. That is usually accomplished using a flag variable, such as I have set here, setting it to true. Then as you go through the process of looking at each form element, you set that back and forth depending on whether there's an error. Finally, if everything is okay, then you use the submit event of that form object to send the data. So how do we access form elements? You will notice that any good programmer will code in both a name and ID attribute for each form element. The name is for the server. These name value pairs are sent to the server. The name identifies the form element for the server. The ID attribute identifies the form element for JavaScript and CSS. Very important concepts here. Please pay attention. In the early days of HTML, we had forms. However, we didn't necessarily have CSS, and we definitely didn't have the DOM, but we had forms in JavaScript. So there were some earlier, more primitive ways to access the form and form elements, which I will just briefly cover. We have the document.forms array. Notice the brackets. This would be an array which would reference the number of forms on the page. It is possible to have more than one form on a page. However, they each have their own opening and closing form tag and their own submit button. You do not put a form inside a form. Since we can access the forms using an array, if I were to code document.forms0, that would refer to my first form, .length, which is a property, that will give me the number of elements in my form. In the early days, they would use this to loop through things. All we need to do is say document.getElementById, the name of the form, .length. Again, there was no ID attribute in the early days of the web. Therefore, if you wanted to access a form element, this is how you had to do it, using the elements array. So here we have document.form1.element0 would be the first form element. You also can do that using document.form1.fname. Now, in these instances, when I say form1, FRM1, I don't mean get element by ID. I mean the name. Okay, the early days of JavaScript, they actually used the name attributes to reference things because there was no ID. Using an arrays or the name attribute to access a form element is old technology, used before we had the DOM. We will not use that in this class. In form validation, there is this concept of a required field. There might be certain text boxes that are required to have a value, such as your name, address, phone number, email, etc. So this is how we commonly validate a text box. We check to see if it is empty. I would first like to draw your attention to the syntax of the input tag. Type equals text indicates it's a text box. Type equals text is the default for the input tag. Therefore, you don't have to put it there. You will automatically get a text box. By the way, there are about 20 HTML elements that are created using the input tag, and they all vary by the value of the type attribute. Text is the default. So we have a name attribute and an ID attribute. There is also in HTML a max length attribute, which limits the number of characters that a user can type in. Please use this. You do not want people typing their life history in your text box when all you're asking for is your name. Hackers use forms to enter malicious data, and if they can fit a lot of code in your text box, it's going to be sent to the server. Not to say that we don't check for that, but make your forms as error-proof as possible. Validating a text box is typically checked to see if it has a value. How do we do that? First, we access the text box, get element by ID, fname, .value, that's the value property. So then we check. If the value equals nothing, which is an empty string, then we know it is empty, and then we can give them an error message or act on that. So this is the process of checking or validating a text box. There might be times when you want to determine if the user checked a checkbox. Often we use a single checkbox to ask the user a question about something. Let's take a look at the syntax. Input type equals checkbox. That puts the check on the page. Name equals pet, ID equals dog. Why is the name and the ID values different? ID works for JavaScript, and there may be multiple checkboxes. So typically, when it comes to working with checkboxes or radio buttons, the ID values are different and the name values are the same. Now, because the user just clicks into this box, they don't type anything, we need to code in a value inside that input element indicating what that click means. And in this case, I have value equals dog. Checkboxes have a checked property. This is a JavaScript property. This property will only return true if it's checked. And by the way, a checkbox will only return a value if it's checked. So if you're sending data to the server and a checkbox is optional and it's not checked, nothing is going to be sent. First, we're going to access that element, get element by ID dog, stored in a variable. Then we're going to test if the checked attribute is true. And if it is, then you might want to say something. And if it is true, you can also retrieve the value. Again, you cannot retrieve a value unless it is checked. A series of checkboxes work the same way. It is typically not a requirement to check checkboxes unless it's a single checkbox. However, I'm showing you how we can retrieve the values from a group of checkboxes. And you would do this using a for loop. All of these elements, because they all share the same name attribute, constitute an array. When we studied the document object model, if you recall, there was get elements by name, and I did specify that that is reserved for form elements. This is the only time JavaScript actually works with the name attribute. Every time else it works with the ID attribute. Here we have get elements by name, which is very similar to get elements by tag name. These all share the same name attribute. Therefore, it is an array. We have a length. We can loop through it to determine if it's checked, and then we can retrieve the values. Radio boxes share most of the same features as checkboxes, with a few exceptions. Number one, they have to have the same name. Technically, checkboxes can have different name attributes. However, radios have to have the same name. Once you click into a group of radios, one is selected and you cannot unselect, whereas checkboxes you can check and uncheck. Radio groups are what are called mutually exclusive. It means within a group of radios, only one value will be returned. Within a group of checkboxes, all the values can be returned if they're checked. Within a group of radios, only one can be checked, so therefore only one will be returned. So we would test to see if a radio was checked in the same manner using get elements by name, looking at the length of that array, and looking at the checked property. So this is what you would need to do to validate if they did check a radio. A drop-down list. Let's take a look at the HTML. We have the opening and closing select element, and inside we have the option element for each choice. The ID and the name attributes belong to the select element. You can only choose one value or select one value. By default, the first value is always selected. So, supposing this was a requirement, they had to make a choice. How do we determine if they've made that choice or not? We test to see if the first value is still selected. And we do that by looking at how we've coded it. Here I have in my first option value equals nothing, which is an empty string. So in my if condition, I check for that value. Notice it is document.getElementById car because that is the ID of the select. The other way you can determine if they made a selection is by using the selected index property. The selected index property it's just a value of essentially the options array. Again, because we have a collection of tags, it constitutes an array. Arrays are index based, and so here we are starting at 0. And that's another way of determining if the first selection is still there or not, meaning they did not make a selection. After it has been determined that all of the values in the form have been filled in correctly, then you will submit the form and the action will be called, and you will typically see some kind of message on the web page you are directed to